Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Why Did Russia Conquer Siberia by History Matters. I've definitely got some thoughts on this one, but I'll save it for the reaction itself, which I think is going to definitely be an interesting one. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I would appreciate it if you would become a channel member by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button, which gets you exclusive content, or check out the Patreon, which is linked in the description below, which also gives you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, I'm excited to get into this video, so let's jump right into it.
Russia, as you'll be aware, is huge, growing from a medium-sized state in the mid-1600s.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, if you look at it at that point, it's already pretty damn large. Sure, more medium-sized, more comparable to other countries, but even from the early days, Russia was a big country, and over time, of course, it would become massive.
Century to this in the mid-1700s. Most of these lands are in what's called Siberia, which were difficult to govern due to their sheer size and placed Russia in contact with more potential rivals. As such, this raises the question, why did Russia conquer Siberia? What did it have to gain from doing so? Well, it won't surprise you to know that the primary reason was money. As
always, conquer more territory, more financial benefits, though oftentimes more problems.
The reign of Ivan the Terrible, Moscow's lifeblood was trade, often in furs. These were sourced from the neighbouring lands and states, which often came into conflict with Moscow. In 1552, Ivan conquered the Khanate of Kazan and soon afterwards the Astrakhan Khanate. These conquests were both primarily to give Moscow control of the Volga River and thus the region's trade routes.
Yeah, well, a big goal of early Russia was to expand, and early into mid-Russia was to expand, gain access to more trade routes, gain access to more waterways. For a long time, Russia wanted access to a warm water port. This was one of the main goals of Peter the Great. He wanted a port that wouldn't be frozen over for most of the year because a lot of Russia is very cold. And so many of their port cities, the few they did have, would be frozen and unusable for most of the year. So Russia definitely wanted to expand in order to improve trade relations and make a little bit of that money.
So, with the economic lifeblood of Moscow secured, along with some new fancy farmland and peasants there to tax, why did Ivan and his successors push for more? Well, Ivan sent a man called Yermak Timofeyevich to lead an army of Cossacks to pacify the neighbouring states. And he did this for two reasons. The first was to prevent raiding into Moscow's territories, and the second was to extract tribute in the form of furs which would then be sold on to Europe. After the Russians conquered Sibir, from which Siberia gets its name, there was little in the way of organised resistance left, which as a result meant that it only took 60 years for Moscow to conquer all of this.
Yes, and so this is one of the main reasons why Russia conquered Siberia, I would say due to the relative lack of resistance. Now, if you look at that massive expanse of land that is now referred to as Siberia, a lot of it is extremely cold, very underpopulated, and pretty sparse. There's a lot of beautiful forests throughout a lot of it, but there's not a whole lot going on. It's a very difficult place to live. I mean, this is why the later czars would send a lot of political exiles over there. Not necessarily a great place to live day to day, though the exiles weren't too terrible. And so, as Russia was expanding eastwards, like I said, it's relatively underpopulated. There are a lot of native peoples, but they're pretty spread out, and they can't really put up any sort of organized resistance. There were really no big states, kingdoms, confederations in this area. I mean, if you look at where Russia has expanded in every direction, they basically expand until they come into contact with a power who can resist them. So if you go all the way to the east, well, Russia starts coming into contact with China, who would become less and less powerful over the years as it would fall to European colonizers, but it was still powerful enough to resist total Russian domination, unlike the native peoples of Siberia, who really couldn't. There was very little they could do, and so Russia advanced through Siberia almost unopposed. Now, there are a lot of other territories, like the Caucasus, that Russia would take a lot more effort to conquer. Russia would fight a lot of wars with the Ottomans and the people of the Caucasus and in the Balkans and etc., and with other colonial powers over territories they wanted to conquer. But Siberia is not an example of that. Siberia was relatively easy to conquer. Now, it was more difficult to govern because it is such a massive expanse of land. It's obviously really hard to settle out there, really hard to connect. I mean, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was their best achievement in that regard, but they'd have to wait hundreds of years after this until we get to that. So, easy to conquer, difficult to actually effectively govern and administer.
And it made its way there because, frankly, nobody could stop them. And for the Tsars of Russia, expansion only had upsides.
Yep.
Siberia was cheap to govern because it basically wasn't governed.
Right. It's exactly what I'm saying. It's funny. They said it's easy to govern. I said it's difficult to govern, but for the same reason, which is that they didn't actually govern it. So it's actually incredibly difficult to govern if you wanted to govern it, because it's really, like I said, difficult to set up consistent settlements out there. But if you want to sort of flip that, it's also really easy to govern, because you don't really have to govern it. So basically the same point, but said differently.
Russia planted trading posts and small fortresses along the frontier, which existed to protect roads and river crossings from raiders. As for most of the people who lived in Siberia, many had little idea that they now lived in a place called Russia.
Yeah, I think a lot of people know this, but, there's still this sort of stereotypical idea of a Russian, which is primarily, sort of a white person from Western Russia. But if you look at the entire country of Russia, the population is actually really diverse. There are a lot of people groups within Russia, a lot of different indigenous peoples, different religious groups, Jews, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, a lot of different ethnicities, Turkic peoples. I mean, there is a whole selection of diverse peoples throughout Russia. I feel like that is sometimes a little underrepresented, even by the government of Russia themselves, but I do feel there is sort of increasing awareness of this over time.
In fact, in much of Siberia's north, Russian influence was basically non-existent, and some parts of it wouldn't be fully mapped until the Soviet Union carried out its census.
Wow, now that's pretty crazy. But not that surprising, because who exactly is going to compete with Russia over domination of northern Siberia? I mean, nowadays, some of those colder regions in the Arctic and up north, we are having a bit of international competition over them due to global warming. They're getting a little easier to conquer. But even now, and especially at this point, Russia's the only dog in this fight. You're not going to have a lot of competitors to conquer Siberia.
It's just that the Russians claimed it, and the people who made the maps weren't exactly going to argue with them. Eventually, the Russians would run into a major power which wanted to expand into the region, the Qing dynasty.
Yes, and I don't even have to talk. They're making the points I've already made, but that's exactly what I said earlier. Russia continued to expand until it ran into a major power that could halt its expansion. And this is how it would go in every direction. I mean, Russia always wanted to expand west as well, and they would expand their sphere of influence west, unless buttressed by more powerful countries and polities to the west of them. And, of course, to the west of Russia is the rest of Europe, and so there were a lot of more powerful countries compared to the east. But there was China, and later on Japan, who would compete with Russia in the region.
When they first came into contact, the Qing were quick to shoot at the Russians until they left. Local leaders continued fighting until leadership in Moscow formally sued for peace. It was agreed that in return for some limited trade access, Russia would renounce any claim to these lands and acknowledge Qing ownership. After both sides had agreed, it wasn't long before the Russians took everything to the north.
I mean, this alone is great proof, or a great example of how large and diverse Russia is. To the west of Russia, they're close by countries like, in the medieval times, Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Empire, the rest of the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and then you move east, and they also border China. We're going from Central and Eastern Europe all the way to Eastern Asia. Like, what a massive expanse of land for one country to control.
Again, this was because nothing was stopping them, and it's not like it cost the government much to do so. Also, Russia was now about 20 times as large as it had been a century prior, and its sheer size and by extension prestige was one of the reasons that European leaders acknowledged Russian Tsars becoming Russian emperors. When China would later find itself on the receiving end of European imperial policy, Russia was quick to capitalize.
Yeah, I think, sort of commonplace references to Russia, particularly back then, would often refer to Russia's size. People thinking of the Russian giant or the Russian bear, thinking of just this massive hulking imperial power. I would say that the size of Russia definitely played a big role in that, in the rest of the world's, and particularly Europe's, perception of Russia. Also, that massive expanse of land would give them access to a lot of natural resources. So this wasn't just a symbolic thing, this was also an economic thing.
And it took the lands it had previously been denied, meaning that the country would stretch all the way from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Sea of Japan in the east.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. And
all right. That was a good one. I thought it was pretty interesting. I always like these types of videos on these sort of interesting topics that are very broad, but perhaps not often actually talked about. I had a good time with this one. Once again, if you guys enjoyed this, please check out the Patreon or become a channel member. Leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.